Now for the press review then, and we're going to take a look at the French press discussing how first responders were unable to quickly reach injured protesters at an environmental demonstration this past weekend. For that, Solange Moujon is here.
Yeah, the extreme violence at the Saint-Soline protest has been in the French press all week. But today, Libération is taking us through a minute-by-minute playback of what happened. As protesters were met with police over a water reserve basin. It asks what went wrong. And a judicial investigation is actually underway, one that Libération says in its editorial that it hopes will clarify how authorities failed the protesters. Now, in addition to questions of what kinds of weapons were used against the protesters, ones that blew off a protester's hands, and also ones that put two people into critical condition. They are still in critical condition. Le Monde, along with Libé and with Mediapart and other papers as well, they've been looking into audio recording proof of why first responders were told not to, or may have been told not to aid the injured immediately. As Le Monde explains, Gérald Darmanin is vowed that the medics were never kept from intervening, but on the left, there is an increased call for the Interior Minister to resign. Now, for Mediapart, it has a bit of a wordplay today, saying Darmanin is the danger from within. In a multi-person expose on the Interior Minister, they say he is a minister of lies after a series of falsehoods on his part. Now, Le Figaro is covering this. Again, another image of Darmanin, the minister of lies. Now, Le Figaro is covering this in a different way. It's the conservative paper says the Interior Minister wants to embody order. He has to remove some of the heat that's on him. He's turned, the paper says, to what he calls the ultra-left and has dissolved an environmental group called Les Soulèvements de la Terre. But was that the right move? That's the question that La Croix is asking today. It concluded that the government's attempts to equate an environmental movement with terrorism is wrong, that sometimes it says civil disobedience is simply about rightfully standing up for things, especially, it says, when the government isn't stepping up to the plate in regard to the environment.
Now, staying on that theme of the environment, then, Solange, Emmanuel Macron is in the Alps today to discuss France's water plan.
Yeah, Huffington Post tells us this is Emmanuel Macron's first visit outside Paris in 2 months. He'll be unveiling a long-awaited plan on France's water use as the nation is increasingly suffering from massive droughts and a record number of days this year of no rain this past winter. Courrier International is actually covering the water use in the world today. It's focusing on how the US, Europe, and Africa are looking for new and different solutions to preserve this essential resource. And France's politics in regard to water and in regard to climate change, well, they could one day be before a court. As Reuters tells us, the UN has voted to pass a resolution that asks the International Court of Justice to define a nation's legal obligations when it comes to climate change. It is being hailed as a historic resolution. Now, sidestepping slightly, but staying with legal woes and with Macron as well, Le Parisien tells us that a woman has been charged with calling the president an ordure or trash. She risks a €12,000 fine and will be judged this June. She says she is being made a scapegoat in a period, quote, in a period of repression where the government is trying to intimidate protesters.
Well, we'll turn now to a democracy debate in India with Prime Minister Narendra Modi praising his nation yesterday at the Summit for Democracy.
Yeah, as the Times of India tells us, Modi was waxing lyrical about Indian democracy, saying India is the mother of all democracies, and India, being the fastest growing economy, he says, is proof of that. But the comments come after, as Al Jazeera explains, Indian democracy, it says, is facing, in this opinion piece, it says that Indian democracy is facing what it calls an existential threat, or, quote, a complete breakdown of all civil norms and bipartisanship, end quote. Now, the New York Times, in this vein, says that after Rahul Gandhi's expulsion from Parliament over a defamation case and its conviction, Modi's party is trying to discredit dissent, and the opposition is being manipulated by the judiciary, by Modi's party. Now, political woes aside, the Times also has a piece today that wonders if India can change the world. If the next decade will be India's for the taking, it asks, could it bypass China as a tiger economy? Nicholas Kristof argues that that is possible if India boosts its education, adds more women into the workforce, and improves manufacturing.
Finally, Solange, you found a couple of science articles that take a long look back.
Yeah, the first is in regard to the oral history of Swahilis. I find this fascinating. For 1,000 years, there's been this legend, this oral history, that princes came from Persia and mated with locals. Well, as the conversation tells us, that oral history is now backed up by DNA studies that prove that local African women began having children with traders that came from the Middle East some 1,000 years ago. Now, a second story that applies to all of us, this is in regard to empathy. Slate tells us that scientists have found that our ability to be empathetic is actually likely linked to our ancestry of fish, that our ability to fear, to fall in love, to fall out of love, actually have very ancient pathways. This comes after a study found that fish can feel fear in others, that they too regulate oxytocin, the brain chemical that we use that underlines our own empathy.
Maybe something good to keep in mind the next time you want to chow down on a fish and think that maybe it has the same emotions that you do, Solange Moujon. Thank you very much for that enlightenment, as always.